Voxday.com. Voxday. What am I saying? It's voxday.blogspot.com. I don't even know my own site. And of course, Voxservative. So last night I was talking about the failure of the neoliberal world order, and my battery on the iPad ran out just as I was reaching a conclusion. And some of you expressed an amount of disappointment with that. So what I was going to say is that a lot of people are only looking at what is happening with regards to the revelations of the swamp's interference in U.S. presidential elections dating back to 1980. And they're only looking at it in regards to what that says about the United States and what's going to happen in terms of the United States. Now, I think it's incorrect to say that nothing's going to happen. Donald Trump just sent a very clear, very strong message that he expects something to happen and that he's going to make something happen. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of executive orders might be coming out tomorrow. But beyond that, whether anything happens in the United States or not, something very significant has just happened. Something of global ramification, something with global ramifications has just happened. And what that is that the United States has finally lost its perceived moral superiority. It has lost the perceived moral high ground that it possessed for most of the last 50, 60 years. We've been arguing for decades that the U.S. system is better than the Chinese system, that it's better than the Soviet Union, that it's better than the other competing systems. In fact, that's where Francis Fukuyama came up with this idea of the end of history, because what the end of history meant is that the neoliberal world order had triumphed, finally, once and for all. Now we know that's not true. Fukuyama himself has been backtracking on that just because he wants to maintain his intellectual credibility. But what we're seeing is that the United States system is just as corrupt as everywhere else. I was reading a book called Il Gatto Pardo by an Italian writer. And it's a fascinating book because he was a member of the Italian aristocracy himself, although he was writing about his grandfather, and who was a member of the Sicilian royal house. And what was fascinating to me and what was very significant is the way that the vote in Sicily completely destroyed the faith of the Sicilian people in this particular town because the guy who was conducting it falsified the vote. It was the very first chance they had to vote. They were voting on the unification of Italy, what's called the Risorgimento, and all the different towns and principalities and so forth were given the opportunity to vote on it. And they did. And the vote was reported as unanimous, even though a number of people voted no and knew they voted no. And the prince who was talking to his gamesman, who admitted that he had voted no, and he was realizing that through that act of faithlessness, through that act of corruption, through that desire to present a united, unanimous front, the people conducting the vote had rendered the entire process corrupt and false. And that's exactly what has happened with the revelations that the FBI was using the swamp creature Stefan Harper to interfere with the most recent presidential election, to interfere in the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But the damning thing, the thing that is going to do and is currently doing so much international damage, is the revelations that Harper has been engaged in this activity since the Carter administration. It's not an accident that we had this Bush, Clinton, Bush, Clinton system where we had a very small group of people from whom to choose, because that's what the swamp arranged. That's what the swamp wanted. And so when you see this happening, you realize that the U.S. system is every bit as corrupt, as every bit as anti-democratic as the system in other countries that are much more openly corrupt. And in fact, the ironic thing is that in Italy, it's actually less corrupt now because the Italians have voted the swamp out. Salvini, at the head of the Liga, and the Movimento Cinque Stelle are both strongly anti-EU parties. And they've actually, just today, created an alliance and come together, even though the Liga is of the north and conservative, and the Cinque Stelle are more of the south and more left-wing, but they are both pro-Italian. They're both anti-EU. They're described as Eurosceptic. I think they're beyond Eurosceptic. But what's interesting now, and to get back to the point, is that I've known for years, for over a decade, that Ben Shapiro is a fraud. I know it out of his own mouth. Ben Shapiro admitted to me in email that he was a fraud, that he was someone else's creation, and that all he was doing as a young kid was repeating Republican talking points. That's all he did. I mean, you can confirm it by going back and reading his old columns. And he had a crisis of conscience, and he wanted to get some advice from me because I was an older, more established columnist, more successful columnist on the same site. My readership at WorldNet Daily was 6 times greater than his. Not that many people read his column. Now he made his bargain with the devil, and he has his profile has been raised considerably as a result, even though he's still not doing much more than repeating the talking points that other people feed him. He's not stupid. He's reasonably quick on his feet. He is able to deal with, your average lefty, your average SJW. But Shapiro is definitely not a constitutional conservative. Shapiro is not a conservative of any sort, except possibly, I don't know exactly what branch of Judaism he practices, but that's about the only thing that's genuinely conservative about him. But even though, I knew that he was somebody else's creature, I didn't make the connection until he came out today and was trying to defend the FBI. He's trying to publicly defend the deep state. He's trying to defend the swamp. You don't have to take my word for it. Go read his Twitter feed. That's exactly what he's doing. And you ask yourself, why and how could you possibly defend this? Even the Washington Post, even the New York Times has offered fairly feeble pro forma defenses. I mean, they kind of said, well, maybe the FBI was protecting the Trump campaign. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But here's what a lot of people don't understand is that Never Trump and the swamp are the same. Never Trump is part of the swamp. It's not necessarily a particularly significant or influential part of it. They're much more intended to be. On the basis of what I have seen, they appear to be more the sacrificial lambs. They're supposed to play the part of the Washington Generals. But if you look at these people that are being held up as the approved opposition, if you look at Jordan Peterson, who's he connected to? The UN, he's connected to John Podesta, he's connected to a lot of people who are very bad news. Ben Shapiro is connected to not only Jordan Peterson now, but he's connected to the Bill Kristols and the all the folks at the Creator Syndicate, and so it's the same thing. And if you look at what they're doing, if you look at what they're saying, they're playing the same role that William F. Buckley played. And so the interesting thing about all of this is that Donald Trump is forcing these people to show their hand. Think about it. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, who would suddenly become some of the leading voices of the right-wing opposition? Ben Shapiro would be on Fox, he'd be on CNN, he'd be on TV all the time, constantly talking about how bad the things were that Hillary is doing. And exactly the way that the Jonah Goldbergs and the Bill Kristols were the big opposition to Bill Clinton. And so let me answer a question that someone asked. Someone said, how do you know that Jordan Peterson is connected to the UN and to John Podesta? It's very easy. He said that he is. He openly admitted, actually bragged, to having written the narrative to the UN document called A New Global Partnership. And that document had as its governing panel of 27 eminent persons. Among them was John Podesta. And this is not conspiracy theory. You can go to the UN site, download the 81-page document that Jordan Peterson wrote the narrative for, and it's all right there. Okay? So what you have to understand is that there are different elements and aspects to the swamp. You have the academic element, you have the corporate element, you have the NGO non-government organization element, you've got the intelligence element, and then you've got the media element. And all of these media stars are people who have been elevated in some way. Now, some of them might not know, some of them might not realize that they have been elevated or chosen or found to be useful. You know, I mean, it could easily happen to, it could have easily happened to me. It could have easily happened to any other syndicated columnist. You know, how would I know if my column, back when I was syndicated by Universal Press Syndicate, I mean, I was syndicated by the people who were syndicating William F. Buckley, and they actually considered me to be a potential replacement for him. Now, that didn't work out, obviously, but how would I have known if the Swamp had decided that my columns were useful and arranged to make sure that all the editors at all the big newspapers took my column? I would never have known. I would not have had any idea. You know, when I was doing my previous syndicated column, which was a video game review column, you know, it got picked up by the Boston Globe, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and 11 other newspapers. I had nothing to do with that. I didn't know anything about these things. I didn't know about the editors. I didn't know anything. And so that's how it's very easy when you're a writer to have your career inflated by people that you don't know, that you've never met, and that you're not even aware of. Now, it didn't happen for me, thank God, because, you know, clearly my outspoken libertarian views were not something that they were interested in seeing in all the newspapers around the country. But then you look at how people like Ben Shapiro, people like Jennifer Rubin, I mean, think about Jennifer Rubin. She was a left-wing, you know, liberal lawyer in Hollywood. And suddenly, she not only transforms into one of the voices, one of the conservative voices of the Republican Party, but she's in all kinds of newspapers. You know, she gets syndicated by creators, and suddenly her column is everywhere. And, you know, all these conservatives across the country are like, oh, you know, Jennifer Rubin, she's such a staunch conservative Republican, and so forth. But, you know, they are swamp creatures. And that's why they hate Donald Trump so much. I mean, think about it. If Ben Shapiro was the centrist conservative Republican, or whatever it is that he calls himself, if he was genuinely a conservative Republican, wouldn't he be celebrating the vast majority of what the God Emperor has achieved? Why isn't he doing that? Why is he continuing to attack Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump is the most serious threat to the swamp in decades. And we're seeing that play out. We're seeing it play out around the world. You know, and it's more than just Trump. You know, it's not an accident that Trump is surrounded by military intelligence, especially military intelligence from the Marines. You know, they were definitely the least swamp-infested branch of the military, and because of that, they have the they didn't get as they were not as controlled as the other ones. So anyhow, these are fascinating times. What we're seeing in England with Brexit, what we're seeing in the United States with Donald Trump, what we're seeing in Italy with Matteo Salvini and the Liga and Cinque Stelle, what we're seeing everywhere across Europe is the rise of the nationalist right. The pendulum of the last 70 years has peaked, and it is swinging back. It is just beginning to swing back. The neoliberal world order has failed. It's still in place. It hasn't completely collapsed yet. There are still very, very powerful elements trying to hold it up. And honestly, the collapse of it is going to be difficult on everyone. But it's necessary, and the sooner that it happens, the better off everyone will be eventually, everybody who gets through it. But in the meantime, you need to understand that the lines are not necessarily drawn where you think they are. The lines are not necessarily drawn between Democrat and Republican. There's a comment. I bet there are more topics you agree with Shapiro than disagree. That's absolutely false. Shapiro not only disagrees with me, Shapiro is afraid of me. He twice put out calls for debate. I said I'd be happy to debate him. He tucked his tail and ran immediately. But you have to keep in mind, we both are very familiar with the quality of each other's thoughts and arguments. Shapiro isn't even close to being in my league. I've never, ever been anybody else's creature. I've never, ever parroted anyone else's talking points. And so, I always find, it's always funny, of course there's no upside to Shapiro to debate me. I would completely destroy whatever remnants of his credibility he has. The kid is a fraud. He's always been a fraud, and he knows it. A lot of people still don't know. All those twitchy headlines about Ben Shapiro destroys so-and-so with one perfect tweet. His father is the guy who came up with that whole thing. His father, whose name is David Shapiro, writes under the name William Bigelow and Hank something or other, I can't remember, and probably other names as well. And most of what he writes is, it's all on Breitbart. You can find it easily enough. It all came out when Shapiro left Breitbart. But the point is that the swamp is human. The swamp makes mistakes. And so it's important to understand who is on their side and who is not. And some of the people that are swamp creatures will probably surprise you. Some of the people who turn out to have been swamp creatures will probably disappoint you. It's always like that. But the important thing is that we finally have, in the United States, a president who is actually putting the interests of the American people above the interests of the masters of the neoliberal world order. And this is very important because the neoliberal world order is collapsing of its own weight. That's the main thing that you have to understand. If there's one thing that you take away from this, it's that just like communism, the neoliberal world order is failing because it has to, because it cannot sustain itself any longer. And there's no amount of BS, there's no amount of fast talking, there's no amount of fake right, fake opposition that is going to preserve the system. All systems that have intrinsic contradictions built into the system will eventually fail. And so, we're in a very intriguing and very interesting time. And frankly, I just want to watch it all happen and write the history of it. It's fascinating stuff. This is a period in time that the historians of tomorrow are going to study with great interest, because it is going to shape the future in a way that none of us likely imagined. So, anyhow, have a good evening. Look forward tomorrow. Hopefully there will be some interesting news coming out of the White House, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the blog. Have a good evening.